in the rolling hills of California's Santa Ynez Valley, hidden behind ancient oak trees and sprawling vineyards that stretch toward the Pacific horizon, there sits a property that locals have been whispering about for decades. They call it the Hamburger. It is a strange name for a mansion, a bizarre nickname for an estate that spans 554 acres of some of the most beautiful land in America. But when you see the circular house perched on the highest hill of the property, its round shape unmistakable against the California sky, you understand immediately why someone would look at it and think of fast food. Because that is exactly what built this place. Fast food, hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, and one man's obsession with turning a simple idea into a global empire. His name was Raymond Albert Kroc. You probably know him as Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's, the man whose face appears in corporate training videos and whose story is taught in business schools around the world as an example of American entrepreneurship at its finest. But Ray Kroc did not found McDonald's. He stole it, and the story of how he did it, the betrayals and broken promises, the violence and the whiskey, the love affairs and the lawsuits, the billions of dollars accumulated and then given away to causes he would have despised. All of it played out within the walls of this California estate. This is not the story they tell at Hamburger University. This is not the sanitized corporate history that McDonald's wants you to know. This is the dark story of the Double Arch Ranch, and it begins not in a boardroom or a restaurant kitchen, but in the muddy trenches of the First World War. The year was 1917. America had just entered the war that was supposed to end all wars, and across the country, young men were lining up to serve their nation. In Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago known for its tree-lined streets and Victorian architecture, a 15-year-old boy made a decision that would set the course of his entire life. He decided to lie. Raymond Albert Kroc was the eldest son of Rose Mary and Ira Kroc, Czech immigrants who had come to America seeking the same dream as millions of others. His father had done well for himself, speculating on land during the booming 1920s, building a small fortune through shrewd deals and careful investments. But young Ray was not interested in waiting for his inheritance. He was not interested in finishing high school. He was not interested in following the safe, predictable path that his parents had laid out for him. Ray Kroc wanted adventure. He wanted to prove himself, and most of all, he wanted to escape the suffocating ordinariness of suburban life. So he forged his documents. He added 2 years to his age, and he presented himself to the Red Cross as a 17-year-old volunteer, ready to serve as an ambulance driver on the battlefields of Europe. The recruiters did not look too closely. They needed bodies. They needed warm hands to grip steering wheels and strong backs to lift wounded soldiers. They did not care if those hands belonged to a boy who should have been studying algebra. Ray was sent to a training facility in Old Greenwich, Connecticut, where ambulance drivers learn the basics of emergency medicine and vehicle operation. It was there, according to Ray's own telling of the story, that he met another young volunteer who would go on to change the world, Walt Disney. Both of them were too young to be there. Both of them had lied about their ages. Both of them were burning with an ambition that their small-town origins could not contain. Whether this meeting actually happened exactly as Ray described it, historians have debated for decades. Ray Kroc was known to embellish his stories, to smooth out the rough edges of his past until they gleamed with the polish of legend. But what is certain is that both men were at that training facility. Both men were shaped by the experience of preparing for war, and both men would go on to build empires that defined 20th century American culture. The war ended before Ray could see combat. The armistice was signed in November of 1918, and the young ambulance drivers were sent home without ever having loaded a single wounded soldier into their vehicles. But something had changed in Ray Kroc. He had tasted freedom. He had proven that he could take control of his own destiny, that he could bend the rules when they did not suit him, that he could create his own reality through sheer force of will. It was a lesson he would never forget. The 1920s were supposed to be Ray Kroc's decade. He was young, ambitious, and convinced that fortune was waiting just around the corner. He threw himself into one venture after another, chasing the American dream with the desperation of a man who feared that ordinary life would swallow him whole. He sold paper cups for the Lily Tulip Cup Company, traveling from restaurant to restaurant, pitching the benefits of disposable dishware to skeptical owners who saw no reason to change from their ceramic plates and glass tumblers. He played piano in speakeasies during Prohibition, his fingers dancing across the keys while bootleggers and gangsters drank illegal whiskey in the smoky darkness behind him. He sold real estate in Florida during the land boom, arriving just in time to watch the market collapse and the dreams of thousands evaporate in the tropical heat. He sold feminine accessories, embellishments, musical instruments, anything that could be loaded into a sample case and carried from door to door. Ray Kroc was a salesman. It was the only thing he truly knew how to do. He could sell anything to anyone. He could make people believe in products they did not need, solutions to problems they did not have, but he could not find the one thing that would make him rich. Meanwhile, his personal life was unraveling. In 1922, Ray had married his high school sweetheart, Ethel Fleming. They had a daughter named Marilyn. From the outside, they looked like a typical American family, building a life together in the Chicago suburbs. But Ray was never home. He was always on the road, always chasing the next deal, always convinced that his big break was waiting in the next town. Ethel raised their daughter alone, watched the bills pile up, listened to Ray's promises that this time would be different. It was never different. The stock market crash of 1929 destroyed whatever financial security the Kroc family had managed to build. Albert Kroc, Ray's father, lost everything he had accumulated through decades of careful speculation. The family that had once seemed poised for prosperity found themselves scrambling to survive like millions of others. Ray kept selling paper cups, kitchen equipment, anything that would put food on the table. And then, in the late 1930s, he found something that actually seemed to work. A man named Earl Prince had invented a machine that could make 5 milkshakes simultaneously. It was called the Multimixer, and it represented a quantum leap in efficiency for restaurants and soda fountains that were struggling to keep up with customer demand. Ray saw the potential immediately. He bought the exclusive marketing rights to the Multimixer and threw himself into selling them with the same manic energy he had brought to every other venture. But this time, something was different. This time, he was selling a product that actually worked, a product that restaurant owners actually wanted. For the first time in his life, Ray Kroc was making real money. He opened a company called Prince Castle Sales and built a modest empire selling multimixers to restaurants across the Midwest. He was not rich, but he was comfortable. He had a nice house, a loyal secretary, a territory that he knew like the back of his hand. He was also 50 years old, and he was running out of time. The post-war years should have been golden for Ray Kroc. America was booming. Soldiers were coming home, getting married, having children, buying houses in the suburbs. They needed places to eat. They needed products to buy. They needed salesmen like Ray to show them what they wanted. But the multi-mixer business was dying. Cheaper competitors had flooded the market. Hamilton Beach was selling mixers for a fraction of what Ray charged. Restaurant owners who had once eagerly signed purchase orders were now shaking their heads, telling Ray that they could get the same functionality for less money elsewhere. Ray was 52 years old. His body was breaking down. Diabetes was ravaging his system, requiring daily injections of insulin. Arthritis was warping his joints, making every handshake an exercise in concealed agony. His marriage to Ethel had become a cold formality, 2 strangers sharing a house and little else. He was, by any reasonable measure, a failure. A man who had spent 3 decades chasing success and never quite catching it. A man whose best years were behind him. And then, one day in 1954, he noticed something strange in his order book. A single restaurant in San Bernardino, California, had ordered 8 multimixers, 8 machines that could make 40 milkshakes at the same time. Ray stared at the order, certain there must be some mistake. No restaurant needed that kind of capacity. Even the busiest diners in Chicago rarely needed more than 1 or 2 mixers. He called the restaurant to confirm the order. Yes, they said, 8 machines. And actually, could you send a 9th? Ray Kroc had to see this place for himself. He drove across the country in his car, leaving behind the grey Chicago winter for the endless sunshine of Southern California. Mile after mile of highway, his mind racing with possibilities. What kind of restaurant could possibly need 40 milkshakes at once? What kind of operation were they running out there in the desert? When he finally arrived in San Bernardino, he found his answer. McDonald's. The name was painted on a sign above a small building that looked nothing like any restaurant Ray had ever seen. There were no car hops, no indoor seating, no waitresses in uniform carrying trays of food, just a window, and a line of customers that stretched around the block. Ray parked his car and watched in disbelief as the operation unfolded before him. Customers walked up to the window, placed their orders, and received their food in seconds. Not minutes, seconds. They carried paper bags to their cars or to the small outer seating area, ate quickly, and left. New customers immediately took their place. The menu was absurdly simple. Hamburgers for 15 cents. Cheeseburgers for 19 cents. French fries for 10 cents. Milkshakes for 20 cents. Coca-Cola for 10 cents. That was it. No substitutions. No special orders. No variations. Just the same food, prepared the same way. Served at lightning speed. Ray counted the customers. He estimated the revenue. He calculated the profit margins. And he realized that he was looking at the future of American food. The men behind this operation were brothers named Richard and Maurice McDonald. Everyone called them Dick and Mac. They were middle-aged men from New Hampshire who had come to California during the Depression, chasing the same dream as millions of others. They had tried and failed at several businesses before stumbling onto the formula that was now making them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The secret, they explained to Ray, was something they called the Speedy Service System. It was essentially an assembly line for food. Each worker had one specific task. One person grilled the patties. One person assembled the burgers. One person wrapped them in paper. One person worked the fry station. One person poured drinks. No wasted motion. No confusion. No mistakes. The McDonald brothers had taken the principles that Henry Ford had applied to automobile manufacturing and applied them to hamburgers. The result was a revolution. Ray spent hours at the restaurant, watching the operation, asking questions, taking notes. He could not believe what he was seeing. Here was a business that practically ran itself. A business that could be replicated anywhere. A business that could make its owners very, very rich. And it was being wasted on two brothers who had no ambition beyond their single location in San Bernardino. Dick and Mac McDonald were comfortable. They had their restaurant. They had their money. They had their simple lives. They had even tried franchising a few locations. But the experiment had been a disaster. Franchisees cut corners. They changed the menu. They added items that did not fit the system. They destroyed the consistency that was the whole point. The brothers had given up on expansion. They were content to run their one restaurant and count their profits. Ray Kroc was not content. Ray Kroc had never been content with anything in his entire life. He saw immediately what the McDonald brothers could not see. This was not just a restaurant. This was a system that could be duplicated 100 times, 1,000 times, 100,000 times. Every city in America could have a McDonald's. Every suburb, every highway exit. The potential was limitless. All it needed was someone with the vision and the drive to make it happen. Someone like Ray Kroc. He approached the brothers with a proposition. Let him become their franchise agent. Let him take the McDonald's system across the country, opening new locations, recruiting new franchisees, building a national brand. The brothers were skeptical. They had been burned before. They did not want to see their creation bastardized by greedy operators who cared more about profit than quality. But Ray was persuasive. Ray was always persuasive. It was the only thing he had ever truly been good at. He promised them that he would maintain their standards. He promised them that every McDonald's would be identical to the original. He promised them that their legacy would be protected. On March 2nd, 1955, Dick and Mac McDonald signed a contract with Ray Kroc. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The terms of the contract seemed reasonable enough. Ray would receive a franchise fee of $950 for each new location he opened. He would also receive 1.9% of each restaurant's gross sales. Of that 1.9%, 0.5% would go to the McDonald brothers, and 1.4% would go to Ray. It seemed like a fair split. The brothers would make money from Ray's efforts, and Ray would make money from his own hard work. But there was a catch buried in the contract that would eventually destroy the brothers' relationship with Ray forever. Any changes to the McDonald's system required written approval from Dick and Mac. Any deviation from the original blueprint required their signature. Ray could build 100 restaurants, 1,000 restaurants, 10,000 restaurants. But he could not change a single thing about how they operated without getting permission from two men in San Bernardino who had no interest in change. At first, this did not seem like a problem. Ray was too busy building to worry about changing. He opened his first franchise in Des Plaines, Illinois, just outside Chicago, in April of 1955. The first day's sales were $366.12. It was not a fortune, but it was a start. Ray recruited franchisees from his network of contacts, golf buddies from the Rolling Green Country Club, business associates from his multi-mixer days, anyone with the $950 franchise fee, and a willingness to work. The restaurants multiplied. 1 became 5, 5 became 10, 10 became 20. Ray was finally building something real, but he was also going broke. The franchise fees and the percentage of sales were not enough to cover Ray's expenses. He was traveling constantly, supervising construction, training franchisees, putting out fires. He had employees to pay, an office to maintain, a lifestyle to support. The McDonald brothers were collecting their 0.5% from every restaurant without lifting a finger. Ray was doing all the work and barely scraping by. He needed more money. He needed leverage. He needed control. And then a financial wizard named Harry Sunnibon showed him how to get it. Sunnibon was an accountant who had worked in the finance departments of several major corporations. He looked at McDonald's and saw something that Ray had missed entirely. The real money was not in hamburgers. The real money was in real estate. Sunnibon's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Ray would form a separate company that would buy or lease the land where McDonald's restaurants were built. This company would then rent the land to the franchisees at a markup. The franchisees would pay rent to Ray's company on top of their franchise fees and percentage of sales. It was, in effect, a way of collecting money from the restaurants 3 times over. Once for the franchise, once for the percentage of sales, and once for the land. The McDonald brothers had no idea this was happening. Their contract with Ray covered the restaurant operations. It said nothing about real estate. It did not occur to them that their franchise agent would create an entirely separate business that siphoned money away from the restaurants they thought they controlled. Ray formed the Franchise Realty Corporation in 1956. Within a few years, it was making more money than the restaurant operations themselves, and the McDonald brothers were still collecting their 0.5%, blissfully unaware that they were being cut out of the real profits. But even with the real estate income, Ray was frustrated. Every time he wanted to make a change to the restaurants, he had to get approval from Dick and Mac. Every time he wanted to add a new menu item or modify the building design or adjust the operating procedures, he had to write a letter to San Bernardino and wait for a response. The brothers almost always said no. They were protective of their creation. They did not want Ray experimenting with their system. They had built something perfect, and they wanted it to stay that way. Ray saw it differently. He saw 2 stubborn old men standing in the way of progress. He saw a system that could be improved, optimized, expanded. He saw opportunities being wasted because Dick and Mac were too conservative to take risks. The tension between them grew with every passing year. And then there was Joan. Ray Kroc met Joan Beverly Smith in 1957 in a piano bar in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was 54 years old, married, and miserable. She was 28 years old, blonde, beautiful, and also married. Joan was playing the organ at the Criterion restaurant, surrounded by the sophisticated haze of cigarette smoke and jazz music. She wore a dress that flaunted her figure. She had a drink in one hand and a smile that could light up a room. Ray walked in and felt something shift inside him. He would later write in his autobiography that he was stunned by her blonde beauty. What he did not write was that he became obsessed with her. Joan's husband was a man named Roland Smith, but everyone called him Rolly. He was a Navy veteran who worked for the railroad. He was steady, reliable, ordinary, everything that Ray Kroc was not. Ray began pursuing Joan with the same relentless energy he brought to selling franchises. He visited St. Paul whenever he could invent a business reason. He called her on the telephone. He sent her gifts. Every opportunity required their signature, and they kept saying no to expanding faster, no to changing the menu, no to updating the building designs, no to anything that threatened their precious system. Ray had built McDonald's into a national brand. He had opened hundreds of restaurants. He had made the Golden Arches as recognizable as the American flag, and he was still, technically, just an employee. The brothers still owned the name. They still owned the system. They still owned the rights to everything that Ray had built with his own sweat and determination. Ray decided to change that. He approached Dick and Mac with a proposition. He wanted to buy them out completely. He wanted to own McDonald's, not just franchise it. Name your price, he told them. The brothers looked at each other. They had been thinking about retirement anyway. They were tired of the constant battles with Ray. They were tired of the letters and the phone calls and the arguments. Dick McDonald did the math in his head. $2.7 million, he said. $1 million for Dick, $1 million for Mac, $700,000 for taxes. Ray went ballistic. He did not have that kind of money. He was leveraged to the breaking point. The real estate company was profitable, but most of the money was tied up in property. He could not simply write a check for $2.7 million. He tried to negotiate. He offered to pay in installments. He offered creative financing arrangements. He begged. Dick's answer was cold and final. If it is not cash, we might as well continue with the royalty. Ray was trapped. He could walk away from the deal and continue operating under the restrictive contract, or he could find $2.7 million in cash and finally be free. He chose freedom. Harry Sanibon worked his financial magic once again. He found investors willing to put up the money. He restructured loans. He made promises that would take years to fulfill. Somehow, they scraped together the cash. In 1961, Ray Kroc bought McDonald's from the brothers who had created it. But when he sat down to sign the final papers, he discovered that the brothers had one more demand. They wanted to keep their original restaurant in San Bernardino, the one where everything had begun, the one that still bore their name on the sign outside. Ray agreed, and then Dick asked for one more thing. 1% of all future McDonald's profits. Not 1% of sales, 1% of profits. Forever. It would be a handshake deal. Nothing in writing. Just an agreement between gentlemen. Ray looked Dick McDonald in the eye. He reached out his hand. They shook. Ray had no intention of keeping that promise. The ink on the contract was barely dry when Ray Kroc began his revenge. The McDonald brothers had kept their original San Bernardino restaurant in the sale. It was the one thing they had held onto, the one piece of their legacy that they thought was safe. But there was a problem. The contract gave Ray ownership of the McDonald's name. The brothers could keep their restaurant, but they could not call it McDonald's anymore. That name belonged to Ray now. So Dick and Mac renamed their restaurant the Big Militars. They thought that would be the end of it. They thought Ray would leave them alone to run their single location while he built his empire elsewhere. They did not know Ray Kroc at all. Within a year, Ray built a brand new McDonald's restaurant directly across the street from the Big Militars. Same golden arches, same menu, same 15-cent hamburgers, same everything. Except this one had the name. Customers who had been loyal to the McDonald brothers for years were suddenly confused. Which restaurant was the real one? The Big M that the brothers had run for decades, or the shiny new McDonald's with the famous golden arches? Most of them chose the arches. The Big M began to lose customers. Revenue dropped. Profits disappeared. Within 6 years, the original McDonald's restaurant, the place where the speedy service system had been invented, the birthplace of modern fast food, was bankrupt. The brothers had to sell the building. Ray Kroc had driven them out of business. I ran them out of business, he would say years later, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I hated their guts. And the 1% royalty? The handshake deal that Dick McDonald had asked for. Ray never paid a single cent. When people asked about it, he denied that the agreement had ever existed. There was no paper trail, no witnesses, just the word of 2 old men against the word of a billionaire. The royalty that the McDonald brothers had been promised would eventually be worth more than $100 million per year. They never saw any of it. Dick McDonald lived until 1998. He died at the age of 89, having watched the company he created become the largest restaurant chain in the world without receiving any of the profits. Mac McDonald died in 1971, shortly after the buyout, never knowing the full extent of what they had lost. Neither brother ever spoke publicly about feeling cheated. When asked about the deal, Dick would say that he had no regrets. He would show visitors a copy of the $2.7 million check and say that it was more money than he had ever dreamed of having. But his grandson, Jason French, told a different story. I remember him saying once, when I was a teenager, that guy really got me. That guy, Ray Kroc, the man who took their name, their system, their legacy, and their dignity, and gave them nothing in return but a check and a broken promise. In 1966, Ray Kroc bought his kingdom. He was 64 years old. McDonald's was exploding across the country. The golden arches were appearing in every city, every suburb, every highway exit. Ray was rich beyond his wildest dreams, and he wanted a place that reflected his new status. He found it in the Santa Ynez Valley, about 40 miles north of Santa Barbara, California. 550 acres of rolling hills, oak trees, and stunning views that stretched all the way to the Pacific Ocean. He paid $600,000 for the property. It was a fortune at the time, the equivalent of several $1 million today. He named it the J and R Double Arch Ranch. J for Joan, the woman he loved. R for Ray, the man who had conquered the world. Double Arch for the symbol that had made it all possible. The ranch was supposed to be a corporate retreat, a place where McDonald's executives could escape the pressures of running a global empire, a place where new menu items could be tested, new strategies could be developed, new ideas could be born. But it was really something else. It was a monument to Ray's ego, a physical manifestation of everything he had achieved, and a stage for the next act of his turbulent life. The centerpiece of the property was a structure that would become legendary among the locals. a circular house built on the highest point of the ranch, perched on a hill that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding valley. The locals called it the Hamburger, because that is exactly what it looked like, a round building sitting on top of a hill, like a giant patty on a bun. Inside, the house was unlike anything Ray had ever owned. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire structure, flooding every room with natural light. A central fire pit dominated the main living area, surrounded by comfortable seating where guests could gather for warmth and conversation. The walls were lined with Ray's collection of vintage automobiles, classic cars from the early days of American motoring, polished to perfection and displayed like works of art. This was where Ray would bring his top executives, where he would hold court like a king, dispensing wisdom and demands in equal measure, where the future of McDonald's would be shaped over drinks and dinner, and where some of the company's most iconic products would be invented. The Egg McMuffin, the Chicken McNugget, the MCIB. All of them were developed and tested in the kitchens of the Double Arch Ranch before being rolled out to restaurants across the country. But the ranch was not just a place of business. It was also the site of Ray's third wedding. By 1969, Joan had finally divorced Rollie Smith. The affair that had begun in a poor piano bar 12 years earlier was about to become legal. Ray planned the wedding himself. It would take place at the ranch, in front of the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main lodge. 120 tons of native stone, quarried from the property itself, stacked into a monument that stretched toward the ceiling. Joan wore a stunning dress. Ray wore a satisfied smile. They stood on a giant white polar bear rug, exchanged their vows, and became husband and wife. It should have been the happiest day of their lives. It should have been the beginning of a new chapter, free from the lies and deception that had characterized their relationship for over a decade. But the demons that Ray Kroc carried inside him were not so easily exorcised. Ray Kroc drank. He had always drank. Whiskey had been his companion through the lonely years of traveling and selling. It had been his comfort during the failures and disappointments that had defined his early career. It had been his reward during the successes that finally came in his 50s. But as Ray grew older and richer, his drinking grew worse. His poison of choice was early times whiskey, a cheap bourbon that he consumed by the bottle, not the glass. He would drink in the morning. He would drink in the afternoon. He would drink until his words slurred and his temper frayed. And when Ray Kroc drank, a monster emerged. Joan saw it for the first time shortly after their wedding. Ray had been drinking all day, celebrating some business victory or nursing some business defeat. The specifics did not matter. What mattered was the whiskey and what it did to him. He turned on her without warning. The charming, ambitious man she had fallen in love with disappeared, replaced by something cold and cruel. He screamed at her. He berated her. He made her feel small and worthless and afraid. And then it got worse. The court documents that would eventually become public record described what happened next in clinical, legal language. The defendant has a violent and ungovernable temper and has in the past inflicted upon the person of the plaintiff physical harm, violence, and injury. Physical harm, violence, injury. Ray Kroc was beating his wife. Joan tried to hide it at first. She made excuses for the bruises. She blamed herself for provoking him. She told herself that it would get better, that he would change, that the whiskey was the problem and not the man. But it did not get better. It got worse. In November of 1971, less than 3 years after their fairy tale wedding on the polar bear rug, Joan Kroc filed for divorce. The papers she filed painted a terrifying picture of life with Ray. The violent temper, the physical attacks, the constant fear. She took out a restraining order against her own husband. When Ray returned home from a business trip, he was met at the door by a sheriff's deputy. He was served with divorce papers. He was told that he could not enter his own apartment. The story made the newspapers. But this was 1971. Domestic violence was considered a private matter. The article about the McDonald's mogul and his troubled marriage was buried in the business section, a tiny box that most readers probably skipped over. No one organized protests. No one called for boycotts. No one demanded that Ray Kroc be held accountable for what he had done to his wife. It was just a rich man and his domestic troubles. Nothing to see here. For months, the divorce proceedings dragged on. Ray's team of powerful Chicago lawyers fought back against Joan's accusations. They threatened. They pressured. They made it clear that Joan would face the full weight of Ray's fortune if she pursued the case. And then, mysteriously, Joan dropped the divorce. No one knows exactly why. Some speculate that Ray's lawyers convinced her that she would lose everything if she went to court. Some think that she was afraid of what Ray would do if she continued to defy him. Some believed that she simply could not imagine life without the money and the status that came with being Mrs. Ray Kroc. Whatever the reason, Joan withdrew her petition. The restraining order was lifted. She and Ray reconciled. The matter was never discussed again. But Joan never forgot what had happened. She never forgot the violence. She never forgot the fear. And she began planning her revenge. Joan Kroc was not a victim. She was a survivor. And survivors find ways to fight back. Joan's first act of rebellion was an organization called Operation Cork. Kroc spelled backwards. It was ingenious. A charity dedicated to educating doctors, health workers, and families about the dangers of alcoholism and its impact on those around the alcoholic. On the surface, it was a noble cause. Alcoholism was a serious problem that destroyed families and communities. Any effort to address it should be applauded. But Joan's motivations were not entirely altruistic. Operation Cork was a public announcement to anyone paying attention that Ray Kroc was a drunk. Joan produced television movies about the impact of alcoholism on families. She commissioned educational materials. She funded research. She organized conferences that brought together leading experts in addiction and recovery. All of it pointed, directly or indirectly, at the man she was married to. Ray, of course, hated it. He hated being the subject of whispered speculation. He hated the implication that he had a problem that he could not control. He hated the humiliation of having his wife broadcast his weakness to the world. But he could not stop her. The organization was doing good work. The cause was unimpeachable. Any attempt to shut it down would only confirm the rumors about his drinking. So Ray seethed in silence while Joan built her charitable empire. She also began attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, not because she was an alcoholic herself, but because she wanted to understand the disease that was destroying her husband, and perhaps because she wanted to gather ammunition for whatever battle lay ahead. Joan was patient. She had waited 12 years to marry Ray. She could wait a little longer to see how his story would end, and the end was coming faster than anyone expected. In December of 1979, Ray Kroc suffered a massive stroke. He was 77 years old. His body had been punished for decades by diabetes, by arthritis, by the relentless stress of building an empire. And now, the years of heavy drinking had caught up with him. The doctors were blunt. If Ray continued drinking, he would die. For the first time in his life, Ray Kroc was forced to confront his own mortality. He was forced to admit that there was something he could not control, something he could not fix with money or willpower or the sheer force of his personality. He checked himself into an alcohol rehabilitation facility in Orange, California. Joan had won. The monster that had terrorized her for a decade was finally being caged. Ray emerged from rehabilitation a changed man. He was weaker, quieter, less volatile. The fire that had driven him for 80 years had been dampened by illness and sobriety. In some ways, Joan said later, the last years of their marriage were the best. Ray was finally present. He was finally calm. He was finally the man she had hoped he would become when she first fell in love with him in that Esty poor piano bar. But time was running out. On January 14, 1984, Ray Kroc died of heart failure at Scripps Memorial Hospital in San Diego. He was 81 years old. At the time of his death, McDonald's had grown beyond anything even Ray could have imagined. 7,500 restaurants, 31 countries and territories, $8 billion in annual sales. Ray's personal fortune was estimated at $600 million, and Joan inherited all of it. The San Diego Padres, the baseball team Ray had bought in 1974, wore a special patch on their uniforms for the rest of the season. The letters I Care, Ray's initials, stitched in tribute to the man who had saved their franchise from being moved to Washington. The Padres went to the World Series that year for the first time in their history. Ray never got to see it, and Joan was left alone with more money than she could possibly spend, and a burning desire to use it in ways that Ray would have hated. 6 months after Ray died, something happened that would change Joan Kroc forever. On July 18, 1984, a man named James Oliver Huberty walked into a McDonald's restaurant in San Isidro, California. San Isidro was a working-class neighborhood just north of the Mexican border, a few miles from the affluent communities where Joan made her home. The McDonald's there was like any other. Families eating Happy Meals, workers grabbing lunch, children playing in the small outdoor area. Huberty was carrying a shotgun, a pistol, and a semi-automatic rifle. He opened fire without warning. For 77 minutes, he stalked through the restaurant, shooting at everyone he could see. He shot customers. He shot employees. He shot children. When it was finally over, when a police sniper put a bullet through Huberty's chest, 21 people were dead. 19 others were wounded. Among the dead were children as young as 8 months old. It was the deadliest mass shooting in American history at that time, and it had happened in a McDonald's. Joan was devastated. She had spent her entire marriage to Ray surrounded by the Golden Arches. She had watched him build his empire burger by burger. She had attended openings and celebrated milestones and posed for photographs in front of restaurants around the world. And now those same restaurants were scenes of unimaginable carnage. She immediately donated $100,000 to establish a fund for the victims' families. It was a generous gesture, but it felt inadequate. What was $100,000 in the face of such horror? What could money possibly do to heal wounds that deep? Joan began to question everything. The money she had inherited, the empire Ray had built, the golden arches that now seemed to mock her with their cheerful familiarity. What was the point of all that wealth if it could not prevent something like this? What was the point of all those hamburgers if they only attracted monsters with guns? Joan did not have answers. But she knew that she could not simply sit in her mansion and count her millions while the world burned around her. She had to do something, and she had $3 billion to do it with. Ray Kroc had been a Republican, not just a casual Republican, a true believer, a man who thought that Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal was socialism and that government welfare encouraged laziness and dependency. He donated $255,000 to Richard Nixon's 1970 re-election campaign. He opposed minimum wage increases. He believed that anyone who worked hard enough could succeed without government help. These were not just political positions for Ray. They were articles of faith. They were the principles that had guided his entire life, from the trenches of World War I to the boardrooms of McDonald's corporate headquarters. Joan was different. Joan had watched the San Isidro massacre unfold on her television. She had attended conferences on nuclear disarmament. She had read books about peace and justice and the possibility of a world without violence. And she had decided that Ray's politics were wrong. Spectacularly, fundamentally, dangerously wrong. So she began to spend his money on causes he would have despised. She registered as an independent voter and began donating to Democratic candidates. She gave $1 million to the Democratic National Committee in 1987, a contribution that would have made Ray spin in his grave. She became obsessed with nuclear disarmament. She bought thousands of copies of a book called Missile Envy by anti-nuclear activist Helen Caldicott and distributed them for free. She ran full-page advertisements in major newspapers calling for an end to the arms race. Conservative commentators were outraged. C.L. Thomas, a syndicated columnist, called her MCNUT. The Pentagon does not make McNuggets, he wrote, and Joan Kroc ought not to be trying to make policy on nuclear weapons. Joan did not care. She had more money than she could ever spend, and she was going to use it to change the world. If that meant angering the conservatives who had been Ray's allies and friends, so be it. She gave $50 million to establish the Joan B.N. Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. She gave another $50 million to the Joan B.N. Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. She funded research into conflict resolution. She sponsored scholarships for students studying peace and diplomacy. She built institutions dedicated to the proposition that human beings could learn to solve their problems without killing each other. It was the exact opposite of everything Ray had believed, and Joan took obvious pleasure in spending his money on it. But peace studies and political donations were just the beginning of Joan's philanthropic transformation. She also discovered that she had a gift for giving in ways that made a real difference in individual lives. In 1997, the cities of Grand Forks, North Dakota, and East Grand Forks, Minnesota, were devastated by catastrophic floods. The Red River had swollen beyond its banks, inundating thousands of homes and businesses, displacing tens of thousands of people. The damage was apocalyptic. Entire neighborhoods were underwater. The National Guard was called in to evacuate residents. It looked like something out of a disaster movie. And then, mysteriously, $15 million appeared. The money came from an anonymous donor. No one knew who had sent it or why. The check simply arrived, made out to a fund for flood relief, with no strings attached. Journalists began investigating. Who would give $15 million without wanting credit? Who had that kind of money to spare? They tracked a private jet that had flown into the disaster area shortly after the floods. They traced its registration. They found its owner, John Kroc. The citizens of Grand Forks and East Grand Forks began calling her the Angel, but Joan preferred to give in secret. She did not want the attention. She did not want the gratitude. She just wanted to help. When she read a newspaper story about a 12-year-old boy in Tennessee who had hemophilia and AIDS and was about to lose his private teacher due to budget cuts, she did not write a letter of sympathy. She sent $235,000 to balance the entire school district's budget. When she heard about a hospice in San Diego that needed a new facility, she did not attend a fundraising gala. She wrote a check for $18.5 million. When she learned that her local public radio station needed support, she did not pledge during the annual membership drive. She gave them $5 million. Joan was spending money at a rate that would have bankrupted most people. But Ray's fortune had grown even larger after his death. McDonald's stock had soared. The real estate holdings had appreciated. The billions kept multiplying, and Joan kept giving them away. After Ray died, Joan tried to do something beautiful with the Double Arch Ranch. She remembered why Ray had built the place. It was supposed to be a retreat, a place where people could escape the pressures of their daily lives and find peace in the California hills. What if she could transform it into something even more meaningful? What if she could turn it into a camp for children with cancer? Joan approached the Ronald McDonald House Charity, the organization that Ray had founded to help families of sick children. With her proposal, she would donate the entire ranch to them. They could build cabins and recreation facilities. They could bring in children who were battling terrible diseases and give them a few days of normalcy. A few days of swimming and hiking and laughing instead of chemotherapy and hospital beds. It was a beautiful vision, and the neighbors destroyed it. The wealthy residents of the Santa Ynez Valley did not want sick children in their exclusive community. They did not want the traffic that a camp would bring. They did not want the reminder of mortality in their carefully curated paradise. They filed lawsuits. They organized opposition. They pressured local officials. And they won. Joan's dream of transforming the Double Arch Ranch into a sanctuary for sick children was blocked by people who had more money than compassion. She was heartbroken. In 1990, she sold the ranch to Gerald Kessel, the founder of a vitamin company called Nature's Plus. Kessel paid $6 million for the property. He renamed it the Circle K Ranch and used it as a headquarters for his Human Potential Foundation, an organization dedicated to researching herbs and wildlife biodiversity. The ghosts of Ray and Joan Kroc faded from the property, but they never completely disappeared. In 2002, Joan Kroc received news that would have devastated most people. She had brain cancer. The disease was terminal. There was nothing the doctors could do. She had months to live, perhaps a year if she was lucky. Most people would have retreated into their homes, surrounded themselves with family, prepared for the end. Joan accelerated her giving. She had already donated billions to various causes. But now, knowing that time was running out, she became almost frantic in her generosity. She contacted the Salvation Army with an offer that stunned even that venerable organization. $1.5 billion, the largest single charitable donation in recorded history at that time. The money would be used to build 26 community centers across America. Centers that would serve underserved neighborhoods with programs for children, job training, athletic facilities, and social services. They would be called Kroc Centers. Not McDonald's Centers. Not Ray Kroc Centers. Just Kroc, the family name. The name that would now be associated not with hamburgers and corporate ruthlessness, but with community service and care for the less fortunate. Joan was rewriting the legacy. She also gave $225 million to National Public Radio. NPR was exactly the kind of institution that Ray would have hated. Liberal, intellectual, critical of corporate America. The polar opposite of the talk radio stations that Ray had probably listened to in his car. Joan gave them more money than they had ever received from any single donor. She gave $60 million to Ronald McDonald House Charities, fulfilling the promise she had made to herself after the San Isidro massacre. She gave millions more to hospices and universities and animal shelters and homeless programs. She gave until there was almost nothing left. On October 12, 2003, Joan Beverly Kroc died at her home in Rancho Santa Fe, California. She was 75 years old. Most of her ashes were interred at El Camino Memorial Park in San Diego, next to the man she had loved and hated and ultimately outlived by nearly 2 decades. The rest was scattered in a place that only Joan knew, perhaps the Santa Ynez Valley, perhaps somewhere else entirely. She took that secret with her. Today, the property that Ray Kroc named the J and R Double Arch Ranch sits quietly in the California hills. The circular house he built on the highest point of the land is still there. Its windows still offer 360-degree views of the surrounding valley. Its central fire pit still dominates the main living area. But the vintage cars are gone. The McDonald's executives are gone. The menu experiments and corporate retreats are long forgotten. The fireplace where Ray and Joan were married still stands. 120 tons of native stone, quarried from the property itself, bearing silent witness to everything that happened within those walls. The wedding, the violence, the reconciliation, the death, all of it absorbed into the stones like water into a sponge. The ranch has been listed for sale multiple times over the years. $29 million in 2020, $26.9 million in 2021, $18 million in 2023. Each time, the price drops a little lower. Each time, the property sits on the market a little longer. Maybe potential buyers can sense something. Maybe they walk through those rooms and feel the weight of history pressing down on them. Maybe they stand in front of that massive fireplace and imagine the ghosts of Ray and Joan, still fighting their eternal battle. Or maybe the real estate market is just soft. The McDonald brothers are long dead. Richard passed in 1998, Morris in 1971. Neither of them ever set foot on the Double Arch Ranch. Neither of them ever saw the empire that their invention had become. The 1% royalty they were promised would be worth more than $100 million today, every year, forever. But they never saw a single cent. When Dick McDonald died, he was living in a modest home in New Hampshire. He was comfortable but not wealthy. He had the $2.7 million from the buyout, carefully invested and slowly spent over 37 years of retirement. He could have been a billionaire. He should have been a billionaire. But a handshake deal with Ray Kroc turned out to be worth nothing at all. So what do we make of this story? What do we learn from the rise and fall and transformation of the Double Arch Ranch? Ray Kroc was a complicated man, a visionary who saw possibilities that others missed, a salesman who could convince anyone of anything, a builder who transformed a small hamburger stand into a global empire. He was also a thief, a liar, a drunk, an abuser. He stole from the brothers who invented the system he exploited. He broke promises without remorse. He beat the woman he claimed to love, and he built something that feeds 1% of the world's population every single day. Can those two things be reconciled? Can genius and cruelty coexist in the same person? The answer, of course, is yes. History is full of brilliant monsters, creative geniuses who were also terrible human beings, innovators who changed the world while destroying the people closest to them. Ray Kroc was one of them. But here is the twist that makes this story different. Ray Kroc spent his entire life accumulating power and wealth. He schemed and fought and clawed his way to the top of an empire he had stolen from better men. And when he died, his widow gave it all away, to peace studies and public radio, to homeless shelters and cancer research, to community centers and animal sanctuaries, to everything Ray would have despised. Joan Kroc spent 19 years systematically dismantling everything her husband had stood for. She took his money, earned through ruthlessness and betrayal, and transformed it into something good. She could not undo the harm he had caused. She could not give the McDonald brothers their royalty. She could not erase the bruises from her own body, but she could redirect the river of money that flowed from his empire. She could turn it toward compassion instead of accumulation, toward healing instead of conquest. And she did. $3 billion gone, scattered to the winds of charity. The Double Arch Ranch still stands. The hamburger house still perches on its hill. The fireplace still holds its secrets. But the money that built them, the money that Ray Kroc valued above all else, has been transformed into something he never intended. Schools and hospitals bear Joan's name. Community centers serve families who will never know where the funding came from. Students study peace at institutes funded by a fast food fortune. And somewhere, in whatever afterlife exists for men like Ray Kroc, a salesman from Oak Park is watching his legacy disappear, one donation at a time. The golden arches still span the globe. 40,000 restaurants in more than 100 countries. Billions of hamburgers served every year. But the man who built that empire is gone. His wife is gone. His enemies are gone. Only the stories remain. And a hamburger house, sitting alone on its California hilltop, waiting for someone brave enough to live with its ghosts. This has been the dark story of McDonald's founder's ranch. The tale of Ray Kroc, the McDonald brothers, Joan Smith, and the billions of dollars that changed hands and changed lives over the course of half a century. It is a story about ambition and betrayal, about love and violence, about money and what it can and cannot buy, and ultimately about redemption. Not Ray's redemption. He never sought it and probably never deserved it. But Joan's, the woman who survived the monster and then used his treasure to build a better world. She was not a saint. She had her flaws, her vices, her secrets, but in the end, she chose to do something good with the power she inherited. And that, perhaps, is the real lesson of the Double Arch Ranch. That it is never too late to change. That even fortunes built on broken promises can be redeemed. That the past does not have to define the future. Ray Kroc looked at a hamburger stand and saw an empire. Joan Kroc looked at that empire and saw a chance to change the world. One of them will be remembered as a business genius. The other will be remembered as an angel. And the hamburger house will keep its secrets, waiting in the California hills, until the next owner comes along to write the next chapter of its story. End of script. Total characters approximately 45,000. Note: this is the first segment of the script. The document continues with additional expansions of each section to reach the requested 90,000 characters. Additional expansion. The missing details. There are aspects of this story that deserve closer attention. Let's explore each of them. Ray Kroc's childhood and what it reveals. Raymond Albert Kroc was born on October 5, 1902, in Oak Park, Illinois. Oak Park was, and still is, a Chicago suburb known for its tree-lined streets, elegant Victorian homes, and middle-class population aspiring to something greater. It was the kind of place where dreams were carefully cultivated, like the manicured gardens that adorned each property. Ray's parents, Rose Mary Kroc and Elwa Kroc, were Czech immigrants who had crossed the ocean in search of the American dream. Elwa was a practical businessman who believed that hard work and careful speculation were the paths to prosperity. He speculated in land during the 1920s, buying properties when they were cheap and selling when the market heated up. For a while, it worked. The Kroc family lived comfortably. They weren't rich by the standards of the time, but they were secure. They had a house. They had food on the table. They had hope. But Ray never felt at home in that world. From an early age, he displayed a restlessness that his parents couldn't understand. While other children played in the yards and made friends at school, Ray was always looking for some way to earn money. He opened lemonade stands. He worked in pharmacies and local markets. He was always selling something. At 14, he convinced two friends to open a music store with him. They called it Ray Kroc Music Emporium. The friends sold cheap music while Ray played the piano for the customers. The business lasted a few months before going bankrupt. But Ray had learned something important. He had discovered that he could convince people to do things. That his voice, his enthusiasm, his absolute certainty that he was right, could move mountains, or at least sell some sheet music. School never interested Ray. He found the classes boring, the teachers mediocre, the whole system designed to produce obedient employees instead of bold entrepreneurs. He sat restless in his seat, dreaming of a future that didn't include diplomas or certificates. When World War I began, Ray saw his chance to escape. He didn't want to fight for patriotism. He didn't want to defend democracy or defeat the Kaiser. He wanted to leave Oak Park. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to prove to himself that he was capable of something greater than the life his parents had planned for him. So he lied. He added 2 years to his age on his enlistment papers. He presented himself to the Red Cross as a 17-year-old ready to serve as an ambulance driver. Nobody checked. And so, at the age of 15, Raymond Albert Kroc left Oak Park behind and began the journey that would eventually lead him to the top of the business world. He couldn't have known at that moment that the same willingness to lie, to bend the rules, to do whatever it took to get what he wanted, would be both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. The true story of the McDonald brothers, Richard James McDonald, was born on February 16, 1909. Morris James McDonald was born on November 26, 1902. They were the children of Patrick James McDonald and Margaret Anna Curran McDonald, Irish Catholic immigrants who had arrived in America as children. The family lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, an industrial city where factory work was the expected fate for most young people. But Dick and Mac had other plans. In the 1920s, when the family moved to California, the two brothers began to dream of Hollywood. They wanted to work in the film industry, to be part of the magic that was transforming Los Angeles into the entertainment center of the world. For a time, they succeeded. They worked behind the scenes in film studios, moving sets, carrying equipment, doing the manual labor that kept the dream machine running. But the Great Depression changed everything. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the film industry was not spared. Budgets were cut. Employees were laid off. The McDonald brothers found themselves unemployed, like millions of other Americans. They tried various things to survive. They opened a small movie theater in Glendora. It didn't last long. They opened a hot dog stand near the Santa Anita racetrack. It worked better. And then, in 1940, they opened a drive-in restaurant in San Bernardino. McDonald's Barbecue, as it was originally called, was no different from dozens of other drive-ins that dotted the roads of California. It had an extensive menu of 25 items. It had car hubs on roller skates that delivered food to the cars. It had all the characteristics of a typical American restaurant of the time. And he had problems. Car hops were slow. Orders were confusing. Customers complained. Costs were high. The food was inconsistent. Dick and Mac spent 8 years struggling to make the business work. And then, in 1948, they had a radical idea. What if they simplified everything? What if they eliminated car hops completely? What if they reduced the menu to just a few items? What if they transformed food preparation into an assembly line, like Henry Ford did with automobiles? They closed the restaurant for 3 months for renovations. When they reopened, everything was different. There were no more car hops. Customers walked to a window to place their orders. There were no more 25 items on the menu. Now it was just hamburgers, French fries, milkshakes, and soft drinks. There were no more ceramic plates or glass cups. Everything was served in disposable paper packaging, and there was no more waiting. The speedy service system, as the brothers called their innovation, transformed fast food preparation into a precise science. Each worker had a specific function. Every movement was calculated for maximum efficiency. Each hamburger was identical to the last. The first few months were difficult. Long-time customers, used to being served in their cars, were confused by the new system. Many never returned, but new customers appeared to replace them. Families who wanted a quick and cheap meal. Workers with only 30 minutes for lunch. Young couples with small children who couldn't wait an hour for food. The new McDonald's was perfect for all of them. Within a few years, the restaurant was making over $100,000 a year in profit. It was an extraordinary success. Dick and Mac were rich men, and completely satisfied with what they had. They didn't want an empire. They didn't dream of having restaurants in every state. They didn't have the insatiable ambition that consumed men like Ray Kroc. They just wanted their restaurant, their community, their simple life. And for a time, that's exactly what they had. The meeting that changed everything. Ray Kroc drove for days to reach San Bernardino. He was in his car, a model that had seen better days, crossing the plains of the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains and deserts of the American Southwest. Each mile took him further from the life he knew and closer to something he couldn't yet define. When he finally arrived at the McDonald Brothers restaurant, it was a hot summer day in Southern California. The kind of day when the air ripples over the asphalt and sweat runs down your back before you even get out of the car. Ray parked in a spot where he could observe the operation, and he observed. For hours, he saw the line of customers stretching down the sidewalk. He timed how long it took for a customer to place an order to receive their food. He counted how many hamburgers were served per minute. The numbers didn't make sense. No restaurant should be able to operate with this level of efficiency. No cook should be able to produce food at this speed. No system should function so perfectly. But there it was, working right before his eyes. Ray got out of the car and joined the queue. When it was his turn, he ordered a hamburger, French fries, and a milkshake. 30 seconds later, he was holding his food. He bit into the hamburger. It was simple, straightforward, exactly what it promised to be. There was nothing extraordinary about the taste, but there was something extraordinary about the experience. The speed, the consistency, the feeling that you knew exactly what you were getting even before you placed the order. Ray finished his meal and went to look for the owners. He found Dick McDonald overseeing the operation in the kitchen. Dick was a middle-aged man, with grey hair and an air of someone comfortable in his own skin. He didn't have Ray's frenetic energy, the constant need to prove something. Ray introduced himself. He said he was in the milkshake machine business, that he was impressed with the restaurant, that he would like to know more about how it worked. Dick was used to curious people. McDonald's success attracted businessmen from all over California wanting to learn its secrets. He gave Ray the same tour he gave everyone else. He showed me the kitchen, where each station was dedicated to a specific task. He explained the ordering system, which eliminated confusion and errors. He described how they had arrived at that format after years of experimentation and refinement. Ray absorbed every word, but he was thinking about something much bigger than Dick or Mac had ever considered. He was thinking about franchises. Thousands of franchises. A McDonald's in every city, in every suburb, at every intersection in America. The same system replicated infinitely. The same experience guaranteed everywhere. It was a grand vision. It was also a vision that the McDonald brothers did not share. They had tried franchising the restaurant before. The results had been disastrous. Franchisees ignored standards. They added items to the menu. They cut costs in ways that compromised quality. The experience left the brothers skeptical about any expansion beyond what they could personally control. But Ray was persuasive. Ray was always persuasive. He returned to San Bernardino several times. He phoned. He wrote letters. He presented business plans. He promised that things would be different this time, that he would maintain the standards, that he would protect their legacy. And eventually, in March of 1955, Dick and Mac McDonald signed a contract with Ray Kroc. They thought they were gaining a devoted partner. They didn't know they were signing their own death warrant. The construction of the empire and its victims Ray's early years as a franchise agent were a test of endurance. He opened his first restaurant in Des Plaines, Illinois, in April of 1955. It was a modest success, making a few $100s a day. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a start. Ray began recruiting franchisees from among his acquaintances, golf buddies from the Rolling Green Country Club, former customers from his days selling milkshake mixes, friends of friends who had the necessary initial capital. Each new restaurant required constant supervision. Ray drove from one location to another, checking if standards were being maintained, if the burgers were prepared correctly, and if the customer experience matched what he had seen in San Bernardino. It was exhausting, and it wasn't profitable. Franchise fees and sales percentages barely covered Ray's costs. He was working harder than ever in his life, but his bank balance remained stagnant. Meanwhile, the McDonald brothers continued to receive their share, 0.5% of each sale, deposited regularly into their accounts without them having to lift a finger. Ray resented this deeply. He was doing all the work. He was taking all the risks. He was building something that his brothers never had the vision or the courage to build. And they were profiting from their efforts. That's when Harry Sonneborn came up with an idea that would change everything. Sonneborn was an accountant who understood something Ray had never considered. The real value of a McDonald's wasn't in the hamburgers. It was in the land where the restaurant was built. Real estate. If Ray were to create a separate company that bought or leased the land where McDonald's restaurants would be built, he could charge franchisees rent in addition to franchise fees and sales percentages. It would effectively be a way of collecting money 3 times from the same restaurant. Ray formed the Franchise Realty Corporation in 1956. Within a few years, this company was generating more revenue than the restaurant operations combined, and the McDonald brothers knew nothing about it. The contract they had signed with Ray covered the operations of the restaurants. It said nothing about real estate. It said nothing about subsidiary companies. It said nothing about the creative financial structures Ray was using to build his fortune. Dick and Mac continued to receive their 0.5% of the restaurant sales. Meanwhile, Ray pocketed millions from the rent that franchisees paid for the privilege of operating on land he controlled. It was the first major betrayal, but it wouldn't be the last. The woman WHO changed everything. Joan Beverly Mansfield was born on August 27, 1928, in West St. Paul, Minnesota. Her family was working class. Her father, Charles Smart Mansfield, worked various jobs throughout his life, from railroad telegraph operator to salesman. Her mother was a homemaker and amateur violinist who passed on her love of music to her daughter. Joan grew up during the Great Depression. She experienced deprivation, uncertainty, and the fear of not knowing if there would be food on the table the next day. These experiences shaped her in ways that would only become apparent decades later. Despite financial difficulties, Joan managed to take piano lessons. She had a natural talent. By the age of 15, she was teaching piano to over 35 students, earning money to help her family. She also dreamed of a bigger life. She thought about becoming a nurse, or a veterinarian, or anything that would take her away from the grey streets of St. Paul. But Joan's dreams were interrupted by reality. In 1945, at the age of 17, she married Roland F. Smith, a Navy veteran whom everyone called Rolly. They had a daughter named Linda the following year. Joan's life became the typical life of a young American wife in the post-war era, taking care of the house, raising her daughter, supporting her husband who worked on the railroad. But Joan was not typical. She continued playing piano, now in restaurants and clubs in St. Paul. At night, after putting Linda to bed, she would dress in her best dresses and go to bars where she could play for strangers and pretend for a few hours that her life was more glamorous than it really was. It was in one of these bars, the Criterion restaurant, that she met Ray Kroc. It was 1957. Ray was in St. Paul on business, trying to sell McDonald's franchises to anyone willing to listen. He walked into the Criterion after a long, frustrating day, needing a drink. "You, Joan." She sat at the organ, enveloped in cigarette smoke, wearing a dress that accentuated her figure. Her fingers danced across the keys as she played popular melodies for the patrons. Ray was not a man who fell in love easily. He had been married to Ethel for 35 years, and although the marriage had been dead for a long time, he had never seriously considered leaving her. But something about that blonde woman at the piano awakened something in him. He approached. He introduced himself. He said something charming, probably something he'd used hundreds of times before in sales meetings. Joan smiled. And so began an affair that would last 12 years before turning into marriage, and another 15 years before it ended in death. The case and its consequences. Ray and Joan's relationship was complicated from the start. They were both married. They both had obligations, families, lives they couldn't simply abandon. So they met in secret. Ray invented business trips to justify his visits to St. Paul. Joan would leave the house at night with excuses about performances and musical engagements. They would meet in hotels, in restaurants away from familiar eyes, anywhere they could steal a few hours together. For Ray, Joan represented everything that was missing in his marriage to Ethel. She was young, vibrant, musical. She understood his ambition, his hunger, his need to build something great. For Joan, Ray represented an escape. He was rich, powerful, connected to a world she only knew through movies and magazines. He treated her like a queen, not like a middle-class housewife. The case continued for years. In 1959, Ray convinced Rollie Smith to open a McDonald's franchise in Rapid City, South Dakota. Think about that for a moment. Ray helped his mistress's husband buy a McDonald's franchise. He did this to have a legitimate excuse to see Joan regularly, whenever he needed to visit the Rapid City franchise. For business reasons, of course, he could spend time with her. Rollie became known in the city as Mr. McDonald's. He worked hard to make the restaurant thrive. He believed he was building a future for his family. He had no idea that his wife was having an affair with the man who had sold him the franchise. In Rapid City, people started noticing things. They noticed how Joan looked at Ray when he visited. They noticed whispers and glances that lasted a second longer than necessary. They noticed that the vivacious blonde pianist seemed to have a special interest in the Chicago executive. Rumors circulated, but they never reached Rollie's ears. Or if they did, he chose to ignore them. In 1961, Ray finally divorced Ethel. He was free. Joan wasn't there. Ray pressured her to leave Rollie. He promised he would take care of her, that he would make her happy, that he would give her a life she had never imagined. Joan hesitated. Leaving Rollie meant abandoning the security, however modest, that she knew. It meant surrendering completely to a man 26 years her senior. It meant betting everything on a relationship that had been built on lies and betrayal. She wasn't ready. And so, Ray married someone else. Jane Dobbins Green was the secretary of John Wayne, the famous Western actor.